a family built on power, a will rewritten in secret, and a daughter who refuses to stay silent. When Sarah Lawson's father, Henry, passes away, his fortune and legacy should be protected by his final wishes. But something doesn't add up. The will her mother presents in court isn't the one her father intended. Someone has altered it, someone with everything to lose. As Sarah digs deeper, she uncovers a tangled web of lies, betrayals, and a truth more dangerous than she ever imagined. With powerful enemies closing in, she must decide: fight for justice or protect herself before it's too late. But in a world where influence controls everything, will the truth be enough? Or will it be buried like her father before her? Get ready for a story filled with twists, secrets, and a battle for justice that will keep you guessing until the very end. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Sarah sat in her late father's study, the air thick with the scent of old books and polished mahogany. It had been a month since Henry Lawson's funeral, but the house still felt hollow. She ran her fingers over his desk, remembering the nights she had sat there doing homework while he reviewed court documents. He had built an empire from nothing, ensuring his family's wealth for generations. But something felt wrong. Sarah had come across a stack of letters in her father's desk, one addressed to her. The handwriting was unmistakably his. "Sarah, if you are reading this, something has happened to me. Trust no one, not even the ones you love." Her breath caught. Had he known his life was in danger? A knock on the door made her jump. Mark, her older brother, leaned against the frame. His sharp features were unreadable. "Mom's looking for you. The court hearing to finalize Dad's will is in 2 days." Sarah hesitated before tucking the letter into her pocket. "You seem tense," she said, watching him carefully. Mark gave a humorless chuckle. "Tense? Our father just died, and now we're dealing with a legal mess. What do you expect?" Sarah studied him, searching for any cracks in his composure. "Did Dad ever mention changing his will?" she asked. Mark's expression hardened. "No. And I'd suggest you stop looking for something that isn't there." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. He was hiding something. That night, unable to sleep, she returned to the study, determined to find answers. She searched through more documents, flipping through pages of court filings and business contracts. Then she found it, a draft of her father's will. It was completely different from the one her mother had presented to the family. In this version, the estate was divided equally between Sarah, Mark, and someone named Evelyn Harper. Who was Evelyn Harper? Her father's lawyer, Paul Whitman, would know. But when she called his office, a receptionist informed her that Paul had taken an unexpected leave. Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. Something was very, very wrong. The truth was out there, and she was going to find it even if it meant taking her own mother to court. Sarah stared at the draft will in disbelief. The name Evelyn Harper stood out like a warning. Her father had never mentioned anyone by that name. Why would she be included in his inheritance? Determined to get answers, Sarah stormed into the dining room, where her mother, Victoria Lawson, sat sipping tea. The large chandelier above cast a glow over the pristine table, but the air between them was anything but warm. "Who is Evelyn Harper?" Sarah demanded, tossing the document onto the table. Victoria's fingers tensed around her teacup, but she recovered quickly. "Where did you find this?" "In Dad's study," Sarah replied. "This isn't the will you presented to the court." Mark, who had just entered the room, stopped in his tracks. His eyes darted from Sarah to Victoria, his jaw tightening. Victoria sighed, setting her teacup down with deliberate grace. "Sarah, your father was a brilliant man, but he was also sentimental. That draft is old. He changed his mind. Then why didn't he destroy it?" Sarah countered. "And why is this Evelyn Harper in it?" Mark stepped forward, voice low. "Drop it, Sarah." "No," she shot back. "I want the truth." Victoria exhaled, rubbing her temple. as if Sarah was exhausting her. Evelyn Harper was someone from your father's past. It's irrelevant now. Sarah narrowed her eyes. If she was irrelevant, why was she in his court documents? Before Victoria could respond, Mark grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her into the hallway. His grip was tight. You need to stop digging, he whispered harshly. Why? What are you so afraid of? Mark hesitated, then released her with a frustrated sigh. You don't understand the damage this could cause. Sarah's heart pounded. Then explain it to me. Instead, Mark turned and walked away, leaving her with more questions than answers. Later that evening, Sarah sat at her laptop, researching Evelyn Harper. The name brought up no significant results, no news articles, no social media profiles, nothing. It was as if she didn't exist. But something about the name felt familiar. Just as she was about to give up, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Hello? Static crackled on the line, followed by a voice barely above a whisper. Stop looking for me. Sarah's breath caught. Evelyn Harper? Silence. Then the call disconnected. Sarah's fingers trembled as she lowered the phone. Whoever Evelyn Harper was, she didn't want to be found. Unable to sleep, Sarah crept back into her father's study. There had to be more. She searched through files, running her hands over his bookshelves. When she pushed against one of the shelves, it shifted slightly. A hidden compartment. Inside, she found a sealed envelope labeled Confidential, Court Records. Heart racing, she tore it open. Inside were legal documents, a case involving Henry Lawson and Evelyn Harper. She skimmed through the papers, her mind spinning. Her father had been financially supporting Evelyn for years. But why? Before she could process it, footsteps echoed outside the study. Sarah froze. Someone else was in the house. She quickly stashed the documents back and turned off the desk lamp, her pulse hammering. She pressed herself against the wall, listening. A shadow passed by the door. Sarah barely breathed. Whoever it was, they didn't want her discovering the truth. And she was running out of time. Sarah barely slept that night. The call from Evelyn Harper, the hidden court records, and the mysterious figure outside the study all haunted her thoughts. Whoever was trying to keep this secret buried was getting desperate. The next morning, Sarah decided to track down Paul Whitman, her father's lawyer. If anyone could explain the discrepancies between the wills, it was him. She dialed his office number again. This number is no longer in service. Her stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. Determined, Sarah drove to Whitman's law office in downtown Boston. The glass doors were locked, the sign on the door reading closed until further notice. Peering inside, she saw the once busy reception area abandoned, chairs pushed haphazardly as if someone had left in a hurry. A security guard stood near the entrance. Excuse me, Sarah called out. What happened to the law office here? The guard gave her a wary look. They shut down last week. The whole team just vanished overnight. Vanished, she repeated. Yeah. No explanation. One day they were here, the next gone. Clients showed up for appointments and found nothing but empty desks. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Paul Whitman had handled her father's estate. His sudden disappearance wasn't a coincidence. Do you know where Mr. Whitman might be? The guard shrugged. No clue. But if you ask me, someone didn't want him talking. Sarah's grip on her purse tightened. If Whitman had been silenced, it meant the truth about the will was bigger than she thought. As Sarah pulled into the driveway that afternoon, she noticed Mark pacing on the front porch, his phone pressed to his ear. His expression was tense, his voice low. She approached quietly, catching snippets of his conversation. No, she's getting too close. We have to stop her before she... Mark turned abruptly and saw Sarah standing there. His face darkened. Who were you talking to? She asked. Mark slipped his phone into his pocket. None of your business. Actually, it is my business, Sarah shot back. Paul Whitman is missing. His entire office shut down overnight. Mark's jaw clenched. So? Don't you think that's suspicious? Mark exhaled sharply. Sarah, you're chasing shadows. Just drop it. Like hell I will, she snapped. Dad's will was changed. Someone forged it. And now the one person who could confirm that has disappeared. Mark ran a hand through his hair, looking genuinely frustrated. You don't know what you're getting into. Then tell me, she challenged. He hesitated. For a moment, she thought he might actually confess something. But then he shook his head. Leave it alone, Sarah, for your own good. And with that, he walked into the house, slamming the door behind him. Sarah sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel. She couldn't trust Mark. She couldn't trust her mother. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number again. She answered. Hello? A woman's voice whispered. Meet me at the old courthouse on Willow Street. Tonight. Come a lune. Sarah's breath caught. Evelyn Harper? The call disconnected. Her pulse pounded. She had no choice. If she wanted the truth, she had to go. That night, Sarah arrived at the abandoned courthouse. The building had been shut down years ago, but its grand stone facade still loomed over the empty street. She stepped inside cautiously, her footsteps echoing. A figure emerged from the shadows. A woman mid-40s, with tired eyes and an air of quiet strength. You're Sarah Lawson, she said. And you're Evelyn Harper, Sarah replied. Evelyn nodded. Your father was murdered. Sarah's heart stopped. What? He didn't die of natural causes, Evelyn continued. And if you don't stop digging, you might be next. Sarah's breath hitched. Murdered? That's impossible. The hospital report said my father died of a heart attack. Evelyn Harper's eyes darkened. That's what they wanted you to believe. A cold chill crept up Sarah's spine. Who are they? Evelyn glanced around the abandoned courthouse, as if expecting someone to be lurking in the shadows. Your father suspected something was wrong weeks before he died. That's why he contacted me. He wanted to make things right. Sarah narrowed her eyes. Make what right? Evelyn hesitated, then pulled out a folder from her bag. This. Sarah flipped through the pages. They were old court documents, financial records, and her father's personal notes. One sentence was underlined multiple times. If anything happens to me, follow the money. Sarah's fingers tightened on the paper. Follow the money where? To your mother, Evelyn said. And to Richard Hale. Sarah's stomach dropped. Richard Hale had been her father's closest business partner, practically family. He had given a speech at the funeral, comforting Victoria and promising to honor Henry's legacy. You're lying, Sarah whispered, though doubt was already creeping in. Evelyn sighed. I wish I were. Your father found something in their financial records. Money going missing. Deals happening under the table. He was about to take it to court when suddenly he was dead. Sarah's hands shook. Are you saying my mother was involved? Evelyn hesitated. I don't know how deep it goes. But I do know this: after your father died, Richard and Victoria rushed to secure the estate before anyone could question the will. That's why they forged it. Sarah tried to breathe, but the room felt suffocating. And you? What's your connection to my father? Evelyn's expression softened. He was my father too. Sarah felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath her. That's not possible. He and my mother had an affair years ago. He supported me quietly. But he never told your family. Sarah shook her head. No. If that were true, Mark and I would have known. Would you? Evelyn's voice was gentle but firm. Your father wanted to tell you. That's why he added me to his will. He was ready to acknowledge me. But someone made sure he never got the chance. Sarah felt sick. She had spent her whole life believing her family was solid, unshakable. But now everything was unraveling. A sudden noise from outside made them both jump. Evelyn grabbed Sarah's arm. We have to go. Sarah shoved the court documents into her bag and followed Evelyn through the back exit. Just as they slipped into the alleyway, headlights flashed across the building. A black car was parked near the entrance. A figure stepped out. Mark. Sarah's heart pounded. Evelyn whispered, "He's been following you." Sarah shook her head. "No." Mark wouldn't. The car door slammed shut. Mark pulled out his phone and dialed. Sarah's own phone buzzed a second later. A text from Mark. "Come home. Now." Evelyn grabbed her wrist. "You can't trust him." Sarah looked between the text and her brother standing outside the courthouse. Had he been lying to her all along? Her hands clenched into fists. If Mark was involved, she had to find out the truth. But she had a feeling she wasn't going to like what she uncovered. Sarah gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The drive home was silent, except for the sound of her own pulse pounding in her ears. Evelyn had begged her not to go, but Sarah needed answers. If Mark was involved, she had to hear it from him. The moment she stepped into the house, she knew something was wrong. The lights in the foyer were dimmed, and the usually pristine living room was in disarray, papers scattered, chairs slightly askew, like someone had searched the place in a hurry. Mark was waiting in the study, his back turned to her as he poured himself a drink. "You got my message," he said without looking up. Sarah tossed her bag onto the desk, the stolen court documents peeking out. "I know about Evelyn." Mark's hand froze midair before he set the glass down. "I figured you'd find out eventually." Sarah stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Did you help forge Dad's will?" Mark finally turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something dark, something she didn't recognize. "Not exactly," he said. "Not exactly," she echoed bitterly. "Either you did or you didn't." Mark sighed, rubbing his temple. "I was trying to protect the family, Sarah. You don't understand what was at stake." Sarah felt like the ground was crumbling beneath her. Dad was going to take Richard and Mom to court, wasn't he? That's why they had to get rid of him. Mark exhaled slowly. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Then tell me," she demanded. "Who changed the will?" Mark was silent. Then, from behind her a voice spoke. "I did." Sarah turned sharply. Her mother, Victoria Lawson, stood in the doorway, composed as ever. Her dark blue dress was perfectly pressed, her pearl necklace glinting under the chandelier light. She looked every bit the matriarch of the Lawson family, elegant, in control, and apparently a liar. "You forged it," Sarah whispered. "You stole Evelyn's inheritance." Victoria tilted her head slightly, as if amused. "Stole? No, darling. I corrected a mistake." Sarah clenched her fists. Dad wanted Evelyn to have part of the estate. He wanted her recognized. Victoria took a slow step forward. "Your father was a brilliant man, but he was also naive. He thought emotions belonged in business. They don't." Sarah stared at her, disgust curling in her stomach. "So you killed him." Victoria's lips pressed together. "That's a very dramatic accusation." Mark shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't deny it. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "Did you poison him?" Victoria's gaze didn't waver. "Of course not. But we knew stress would do the job just as well. Your father had a weak heart. We made sure his final days were difficult." Sarah's breath hitched. "You pushed him until he collapsed." "A natural death," Victoria said smoothly. "No court would question it." Sarah felt like she might be sick. "And Mark? You helped her?" Mark swallowed hard. "I didn't have a choice, Sarah." Sarah's world spun. Her own family had betrayed their father, covered up his death, stolen from his legacy. And now? They expected her to stay quiet. Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're smart, Sarah. You know what happens to people who don't cooperate." A warning. A threat. Sarah's fingers tightened around her bag, feeling the weight of the court documents inside. She had the evidence. She had the truth. But could she survive long enough to expose them? Sarah's heart pounded as she gripped the stolen court documents inside her bag. She needed to get out now. Victoria and Mark were watching her closely, their expressions unreadable. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. "You're thinking about running," Victoria said calmly, taking a slow sip of her wine. "But where will you go, Sarah? Who will believe you?" Sarah forced herself to stay still. If she panicked, they'd know. She had to act like she wasn't a threat, like she wasn't about to bring their entire scheme crashing down in court. "Maybe I don't need to go anywhere," she said evenly. "Maybe I just need to make a phone call." Victoria chuckled, shaking her head. "Oh, sweetheart. The police won't help you. By the time they even consider opening an investigation, those papers will be long gone. And so will you." Sarah's stomach twisted. Was she really prepared to go up against her own family? Yes. Her father had died believing in justice. She wouldn't let them silence her. She forced a small, defeated sigh and reached into her bag. "Fine. You win." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "That was fast." Sarah shrugged. "You're right. No one's going to believe me. So why bother fighting?" Victoria watched her carefully, waiting for a trick. Sarah slowly unzipped her bag, but instead of pulling out the court documents, she grabbed the heavy paperweight from her father's desk and swung it at the lamp. Glass shattered. The room went dark. "Sarah!" Mark shouted. She didn't wait. She bolted, clutching the documents against her chest. She stumbled into the hallway, her only goal clear: get out of the house. Get to the courthouse. Get the truth in front of a judge before her mother and Mark could destroy everything. She dashed down the grand staircase, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Behind her, she heard footsteps: Mark, fast and determined. "You don't have to do this," he yelled. Sarah didn't answer. She threw open the front door and ran into the night. The cold air hit her face, but she didn't stop. She sprinted toward her car, fumbling for her keys. Just as she reached the door, an arm grabbed her wrist. "Mark!" "Let go!" she screamed, twisting violently. "Sarah, listen to me," he hissed. "You can't beat them. They'll find a way to bury this. To bury you." She met his eyes. There was desperation there, maybe even guilt. "Then why are you helping them?" she shot back. He hesitated. That was all she needed. She yanked free and jumped into the car, locking the doors. Mark pounded on the window, but she ignored him, starting the engine. She sped off down the driveway, gravel flying beneath her tires. She knew she had to get to the courthouse, but as she turned onto the main road, her headlights caught something in the distance. A black car, parked at the intersection, waiting. Her stomach turned to ice. Someone had anticipated this. Before she could react, the car roared to life, headlights blinding her. It swerved into her path, forcing her to yank the wheel to the right. Her tires screeched as she barely avoided a collision. The black car followed. Her mother had planned for this. Sarah's grip on the steering wheel tightened. She couldn't go home. She couldn't go to the police, not yet. The courthouse. It was her only chance. She pressed her foot to the gas, racing toward the only place that could save her. But the closer she got, the more she realized she wasn't just running for justice. She was running for her life. Sarah's car screeched to a stop in front of the courthouse, its towering pillars casting long shadows under the dim streetlights. The grand building stood silent at this hour, empty except for the weight of what she was about to do. Clutching the court documents, she sprinted toward the entrance. If she could just get inside, if she could find a clerk, a judge, anyone, she could finally expose the truth. But as she reached the steps, a black car pulled up behind her. The door opened. A man stepped out. Not Mark. Not her mother. Richard Hale, her father's former business partner. Sarah's breath hitched. "You've been busy," Richard said, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive coat. His tone was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "I was hoping you'd be smarter than this." She took a step back. "You were involved in this all along." Richard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Your mother and I had to make difficult decisions. Your father refused to see reason. He was prepared to take everything to court, and that would have been bad for all of us." Sarah's grip tightened around the documents. "So you changed." "His will." Richard sighed, as if the topic bored him. Your father wanted to make drastic changes, ones that would have disrupted everything. We couldn't let that happen. You mean you couldn't let Evelyn inherit what was rightfully hers? Sarah shot back. Richard's expression didn't change. Your father was emotional. He made promises he shouldn't have. We corrected his mistake. Sarah's stomach churned. And my father's passing? That wasn't just a coincidence, was it? Richard's smile faded. He wasn't well. The stress caught up with him. Sarah's hands shook. You pushed him until he couldn't fight back. He didn't deny it. Sarah swallowed hard. I'm taking this to the courtroom. I have enough proof to— You won't make it that far, Richard said smoothly. A sound behind her. Footsteps. Sarah turned sharply. Mark. Her brother stood at the base of the courthouse steps, his hands in his pockets. His expression was unreadable. Her stomach dropped. Mark, she said slowly, desperately. Tell me you're not part of this. Richard chuckled. Of course he is. Who do you think called me? Sarah's chest tightened. Mark held her gaze for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. You don't understand, Sarah, he said quietly. You can't win this fight. She stared at him, betrayal crashing over her like a tidal wave. Mark wasn't here to help her. He was here to stop her. Her pulse roared in her ears. She had no choice. Sarah spun and ran up the steps, shoving open the heavy doors of the courthouse. Stop her. Richard's voice rang out behind her. She sprinted down the empty hallways, her shoes echoing against the marble floor. If she could find a judge's office, if she could hide the documents somewhere safe, suddenly, arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her back. Mark. Let me go, she shouted, struggling against his grip. Just stop, Sarah, he pleaded. You're making it worse. She drove her elbow into his ribs. He groaned in pain, loosening his grip just enough for her to break free. Sarah stumbled forward, spotting a door marked Court Records, Archives. She lunged toward it, her fingers brushing the handle. A loud noise echoed through the courthouse, stopping her in her tracks. She turned slowly. Richard stood at the entrance, his patience clearly wearing thin. Enough games, he said. Sarah's breath came in short gasps. Mark looked at her. Something flickering in his eyes, regret, hesitation. But it was too late. Sarah had run out of time. Sarah's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she stood frozen in the courthouse hallway. Richard Hale blocked the exit, his sharp gaze locked onto her. Behind her, Mark stood still, his expression unreadable. The weight of the court documents pressed against her chest. If she lost them now, everything her father had tried to expose would disappear forever. You're out of options, Richard said smoothly. Give me the files, and we can all walk away from this without making a scene. Sarah took a slow step back. You mean without consequences? Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Consequences are for people who don't know how to play the game. I'm giving you a chance, Sarah. She clenched her jaw. Like the chance you gave my father? Richard's smile faded. For the first time, Mark spoke. His voice was quiet but firm. Sarah, just listen to him. Sarah turned to him, searching his face for some trace of the brother she once trusted. You're really siding with him? Mark hesitated, then sighed. You don't get it. This isn't just about Dad's will. It's bigger than that. If you go to court with those files, you won't just take down Richard. You'll take down Mom, too. Sarah's stomach twisted. Mom did this to herself. Mark's jaw tightened. She did what she had to do. Sarah shook her head. She helped forge Dad's will. She let him suffer. And now you're standing here, trying to protect her? Mark exhaled sharply. I'm trying to protect us. You think this ends in a courtroom with a fair trial? It won't. If you push this, you're going to regret it. Sarah's hands trembled, but she tightened her grip on the documents. I don't care, she said. Dad deserves justice. Richard let out a disappointed sigh. I was hoping you'd be reasonable. He signaled to Mark. Sarah barely had time to react before Mark lunged. She twisted away, dodging his grasp, but he was faster. His hand closed around her wrist, yanking her back. "Mark, don't do this," she pleaded. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he muttered, tightening his grip. "You're giving me no choice." Panic surged through her. She couldn't lose the files. She couldn't let them win. With all her strength, she stomped down on Mark's foot and wrenched her arm free. She bolted down the hallway, sprinting toward the court records office. If she could just hide the documents somewhere. A loud crash behind her. Richard had knocked over a chair in frustration. "Enough," he barked. "Stop her." Sarah didn't stop. She reached the records room and shoved open the heavy door. Inside, rows of metal cabinets stretched across the space, each labeled with years of court cases. She yanked open a drawer at random, stuffed the documents inside, and slammed it shut just as Mark ran in after her. His chest heaved as he stared at her. "What did you do?" She glared at him. "It's over, Mark. You can't destroy the files now. They're part of official court records." For the first time, true fear flashed across his face. Richard stepped into the room, his expression darkening. "That was a mistake, Sarah." Sarah straightened. "No, it wasn't. You wanted to bury the truth, but now it's locked in the courthouse forever." Richard exhaled slowly, then glanced at Mark. "Find them? Now?" Mark hesitated. Sarah saw the tiny flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Mark," she said softly, "you don't have to do this." His fists clenched at his sides. A long pause. "Then I'm done," he muttered. Richard turned sharply. "Excuse me?" Mark shook his head. "I said I'm done. I won't help you cover this up anymore." Sarah's heart pounded. Richard's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake." Mark took a deep breath, then looked at Sarah. "Run," he whispered. Sarah didn't hesitate. She turned and sprinted out of the records room, heading for the main exit. Behind her, she heard Richard cursing, Mark stepping in his way. She didn't look back. She had what she needed. Now, all she had to do was survive long enough to make it count. Sarah burst through the doors of the courthouse and into the cold night air, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The street was empty except for the distant hum of traffic. She had done it. She had secured the court documents inside the archives. But she wasn't safe yet. Her car was parked a block away. If she could just reach it before Richard or her mother caught up, she might have a chance to expose everything. She sprinted across the street, her shoes slapping against the pavement. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to move faster. Then headlights. A sleek black car rounded the corner at high speed. Sarah barely had time to react before the tire screeched, the car jerking to a stop just inches from her. The back door swung open. Victoria Lawson stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement, her expression calm, too calm. "You've made quite the mess, darling," Victoria said smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of her coat. Sarah took a step back. "It's over, Mom. The files are in the court archives now. You can't destroy them." Victoria's lips curled into a small smile. "Oh, Sarah, you really don't understand how power works, do you?" Sarah's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Victoria glanced at the courthouse, then back at Sarah. "Do you really think those files matter? A missing will, a few financial discrepancies, nothing that can't be explained away." Sarah's heart pounded. "Dad was going to take you and Richard to court. He had proof of everything. You silenced him because you knew it would ruin you." Victoria sighed, shaking her head. "Your father was a dreamer. He thought fairness existed in the real world. But justice isn't about truth, Sarah. It's about control." Sarah clenched her fists. "Not this time. The documents are evidence." "The law?" Well, Victoria laughed softly. "The law." She stepped closer. "Who do you think pays the best lawyers in this city? Who do you think funds the very judges who oversee these court cases?" Sarah's blood ran cold. "You're bluffing." Victoria tilted her head. "Am I?" For the first time, real fear settled into Sarah's chest. Her mother had connections, influence, money. Would the truth even matter if the people in power were already on her side? No. She couldn't think like that. The truth always wins, Sarah said, voice firm. Victoria sighed. Then I suppose we'll see. She snapped her fingers. The front doors of the courthouse swung open. Richard Hale emerged, looking far less composed than before. His usual arrogance had been replaced by irritation. And, behind him, Mark. Sarah's heart lurched. Mark, she whispered. His gaze met hers. He looked torn, conflicted. Victoria turned to him. Well, she asked. Mark hesitated. Then, slowly, he pulled something from his coat pocket. A key. Sarah's stomach twisted. She recognized it instantly. The master key to the court records archive. No, she breathed. Mark held it tightly, his expression unreadable. I can make this all go away, Sarah. She felt like the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. You promised me? Mark swallowed hard. Mom's right. The system isn't fair. Even if we expose them, they'll find a way out. But if we walk away now, Sarah's voice cracked. You think they'll let you walk away? Mark didn't answer. Sarah's entire body trembled. He was making a deal, a final attempt to protect himself. Victoria placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You've always been the smart one, Mark. Do what needs to be done. Mark's fingers tightened around the key. Sarah's chest constricted. If he handed it over, the evidence would be gone forever. Don't do this, she whispered. A long silence stretched between them. Then Mark turned to Richard and handed him the key. Sarah felt like she had been punched in the stomach. No, she shouted, lunging forward, but Victoria stepped in her way. Richard wasted no time. He strode back into the courthouse, disappearing inside. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. She had been so close. She had risked everything. And now Victoria exhaled, placing a hand under Sarah's chin, tilting her face up. You're strong, my dear. You remind me of your father. Sarah recoiled from her touch. Victoria's expression softened, almost sad. That's why you were never going to win. Mark wouldn't meet her eyes. The final betrayal had come from the person she least expected. And now, everything was gone. Sarah stood in the cold night air outside the courthouse, her world crashing down around her. The key was gone. The evidence, her last hope, was about to be erased. Mark had betrayed her. Richard Hale was already inside, on his way to destroy the court records. Her mother stood before her, composed as ever, as if everything had gone exactly as planned. You should be grateful, Victoria said gently. I'm giving you a way out, Sarah. No more fighting, no more losing. Just walk away. Sarah's fingers curled into fists. You think I'm just going to let you win? Victoria sighed, her expression filled with something that almost resembled pity. You've already lost, darling. Sarah's heart pounded. No, there had to be another way. She turned to Mark, desperation creeping into her voice. You don't have to do this. You can still fix it. Mark's jaw tightened. It's done, Sarah. She shook her head. No, not yet. Her eyes flicked toward the courthouse entrance. Then she ran. Sarah bolted up the steps and shoved the heavy doors open. Inside, the grand hall was eerily silent, the marble floors reflecting the dim overhead lights. Richard was already halfway down the corridor, the master key gripped in his hand. Richard, stop, she yelled. He didn't even turn around. Panic surged through her. She had one shot at this. She sprinted after him, closing the distance as he reached the court records office. He jammed the key into the lock. Sarah lunged. She crashed into him, sending them both tumbling against the door. Richard cursed, trying to shove her off, but she fought wildly, clawing for the key. I underestimated you, he muttered, struggling against her grip. You're damn right you did, she shot back, twisting the key free from his fingers. Before he could react, she yanked the key out of the lock and stumbled backward. Richard's expression darkened. Give it back, Sarah. She clutched the key to her chest, heart racing. "You'll destroy everything." His voice turned cold. "That's the idea." Footsteps echoed down the hall. Mark and Victoria. Sarah's pulse pounded as she looked at her brother. "Tell me you didn't come here to stop me again." Mark hesitated. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Victoria, however, was completely in control. "Sarah, don't be dramatic. Hand over the key." Sarah's grip tightened. "And then what? You erase everything? Pretend none of this happened." Victoria gave a slow nod. "It's what's best for everyone." Sarah swallowed. "Not for Dad." Something flickered across Mark's face at those words. For a brief second, there was silence. Then, Mark moved. But not toward Sarah. Toward Richard. He grabbed Richard by the arm and shoved him back. "What the hell are you doing?" Richard hissed. Mark looked at Sarah, his jaw clenched. "Run." Sarah's breath hitched. Victoria's face darkened. "Mark, I should have stopped this sooner," Mark said. His voice was hoarse, filled with something Sarah hadn't heard in a long time. Regret. Richard lunged toward Sarah. She didn't wait to see what happened next. She turned and ran. She tore through the courthouse, weaving between the grand columns and marble staircases, searching for the one thing that could save her now. A judge's chambers. A locked office wouldn't be enough. She needed to place the files somewhere they couldn't be tampered with. Then she spotted it. The court clerk's office, a secure drop box for evidence submissions. She sprinted toward it, heart hammering, and shoved the key into the slot. The metal door clicked open. With shaking hands, she pulled the original court documents from her coat and slipped them inside. Locked. Safe. She turned just as Richard and Victoria appeared at the end of the hall. "You can't touch it now," she said breathlessly. "It's officially in the system." Richard's face twisted with frustration, but it was Victoria's reaction that caught Sarah off guard. She smiled. Not anger. Not fear. Just quiet amusement. "Well played, darling," Victoria said softly. "Your father would be proud." Sarah's throat tightened. This wasn't a win, not completely, but it was enough. Mark caught up, glancing between Sarah and their mother. His face was pale, but determined. "We're done, Mom," he said. Victoria sighed, then straightened her coat. "If that's what you think, dear." She turned to Richard. "I believe our work here is finished." Richard looked furious, but didn't argue. They walked away, without another word. Sarah exhaled shakily. She turned to Mark. "Why?" Mark ran a hand through his hair. "Because I was wrong." Sarah searched his face, trying to believe it. Maybe, just maybe, he meant it. 2 months later, the court case against Richard Hale began. With the original will now part of the official court records, the truth came out. Fraud. Tampering. Years of corruption. Richard was charged. Victoria, though never formally convicted, disappeared from public life. And Sarah, she finally got the justice her father deserved. As she stepped out of the courthouse, Mark was waiting. "So," he said, "what now?" Sarah glanced up at the towering building behind them. "Now," she said, "we start over." And this time, she wouldn't let anyone rewrite the truth. The truth always finds a way to come out. Sarah fought against impossible odds, and in the end, justice prevailed. But what would you have done in her place? Would you risk everything to expose the truth, or would you walk away? Let me know in the comments where in the world are you watching from. I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories filled with twists and turns. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. See you in the next story.